actually the main reason why I want to show this map is to understand that most of the countries that criminalize same-sex intimacy are clustered together. And so the unique phenomena for LGBTQI plus persons trying to find refuge is that the UN, under the 51 Convention, right, to be a refugee, you have to cross one border and go to the other one, register for the UN, and then wait. Kenya, for example, is one of the only countries in the continent, in East Africa, that accepts refugees based on sexual orientation, gender identity expression, or sex characteristics. And it's a country that criminalizes same-sex intimacy. So if you are from the DRC, if you're from Uganda, you're getting refugees from the DRC, and then people from Uganda are also fleeing Uganda to go into Kenya, which also criminalizes same-sex intimacy. You get the trend here, right? So because of the cluster of criminalization in all these contexts, you're asking refugees people who are seeking refuge to go from one context that criminalizes their identities to another. And how that plays out in a couple of important ways. One, if you could cross the border in the first place, so we've had evacuations where individuals could not actually make it to the border and were detained. So like getting actually across the border if you're in a country that criminalizes you is one thing. Then if you try to register in UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees claims rightfully that they are trying to advance LGBTQI plus rights in Geneva, but that doesn't always translate in the country context. So what that means is that a security guard in Kenya might be homophobic, transphobic, or biphobic. It won't actually let you register for refugee status determination that day. And if you are actually able to register for refugee, you might be positioned in a camp that where you're subject to persecution by other people in the camp. If you go to rainbowrailroad.org, we released a report with Human Rights Watch and ORAM, another refugee migration organization that kind of details some of the abuses of LGBT plus folks in a camp called Kakuma in Kenya. So that's a context in the refugee space in the system, which is why, what we do at Rainbow Railroad is just try to cut through all that and facilitate the universal right to asylum that, while it's guaranteed, countries are trying to deny. But let me give you an example of how this plays out in a country like Uganda, since we talked about it. One of the phenomenon even during COVID is how the pandemic was used as a tool to try to repress LGBTQI plus persons. This is an example in Uganda. I'm going to show you like a 90-second clip. Trigger warning, there are some scenes of violence.
Eno y'ennyumba gye tusisinkanyemu abavubuka abali ebisiyaga nga bangi.
Nasala n'ebitundu ebirala bagamba nti baali bajja okujjanjabibwa ekirwadde ekyamukenenya ku kalwaliro akamu.
Stupid. Wewe.
Well, after the individual were taken to the police station, we worked so hard with our lawyers and different partners to try and get them released. Majority of LGBT persons in the country are vulnerable. It is very clear that local authorities and the police are using COVID-19 laws to again prosecute LGBT persons.
So I share the example because that it's to go back to your original statement. LGBTQI plus persons have always been a convenient tool by governments. to distract for political gain or favor, and in this case, even using the pandemic as an excuse to target a shelter in Uganda.
Thank you, Kimari. Yep. That's very insightful. I see that we have around 9 minutes for questions. If you have any questions to Kimari or Tina, it's open to now. Your hand, please. Oh, there. We have one there. Up.
Thank you to Tina, Kimali, and Georges for being here and sharing your stories. I was wondering if you feel comfortable sharing, how do you manage handling your own trauma while constantly extending support to others experiencing the same or possibly worse trauma?
Two questions more. Or...
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to bring Tina back up?
Yeah. Can we have Tina back?
There we go. Okay.
Okay. All right. Welcome back, Tina. If you can have two other more questions. So we have one here and one there. Sorry.
Where's the next one?
I have one question there and then.
Hi. Thank you guys for the conversation today. I just wanted to ask about one of the slides. There was a graph, it was kind of like a line. I think it was propensity to persecute like LGBT behavior with freedom of press. And I think there was one with a very high freedom of press, but it said like 2 countries. I was wondering which 2 countries have a high degree of freedom of press, but also punish their LGBT populations. I don't know if you have the information, but I thought it was interesting.
Sure.
One last question, then we can answer.
Hi, because you brought up Uganda, it is really interesting for me to know what you think about the British government's decision to send refugees or asylum seekers to Uganda. Rwanda, sorry. And then Rwanda is not a LGBT-friendly country either. Is there anything which the community could do to prevent that? Because, I mean, it's bad. I mean, I was talking to an Afghan gay guy who just arrived in the UK, and he was actually fearing that he's going to be sent to Rwanda. So from one hell to another, to wait for refugee status in a country, I think your organization has a presence in the UK. So is there any plan?
Should we start with the first question?
Yes. So,
I wonder if Tina wants to take the first question.
Tina? So the first question was about your own well-being.
Yes. Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's very crucial, and it's too late to talk about that, because I have seen so many people just burn out and just leaving the country and just not being an activist anymore. And I know for quite some time that's a very important topic. So therefore, I'm focusing on my well-being in the past 5 years. And I think I've been successful in learning how to manage stress and how to work less. But my learning was too late. So at the moment, I'm fighting cancer. And I do believe that my activism and the thing that I've been doing all this work, and I had no life for years, has played a role in that. And my kind of healing process is now that I managed to get myself out of the context that I was working in. So I'm not doing everyday work now in the Hungarian context, and that might help me to heal, but this is very important, and we should, as a movement, as a wider human rights movement, very much pay attention to the well-being of the people who fight on the front lines, who provide the services, because it's very difficult to every day tell to people that you have no good news for them and you can provide no relief. And that's a huge question mark, how we can survive, basically.
I'm a Canadian-born person from the Jamaican diaspora, so I have a degree of privilege in doing this work. Although I work with human rights defenders all the time who sacrificed their lives. We're talking a lot about Ukraine, and we need to talk about Ukraine. It's really important. But 6 months ago, we were talking about Afghanistan, and I went to Pakistan twice, building safe houses with like a trans-led organization that's transformed their work to provide refuge to hundreds of Ukrainians that were hundreds of Afghans that have fled there that were now relocated to other countries, and we don't talk about it anymore. And I have a lot to say about that. But just a reminder that we cannot let our advocacy be focused to what the media turns our attention to, that we have to be looking at human rights across the globe. And we also need to be in solidarity with our movements all the time. I want this session next year to be on the main stage and not in a back room, as an example. Although a really great back room, Kenza. Thank you for all your support in getting us here, because you've been amazing. So that's just the answer about self-care. To answer the other two questions, actually, although the reason why I include the free press is that we have to remember that there's different scores of criminalization, and countries that have better records criminalize same-sex people or want to introduce legislation around against people all the time. So you see countries like Brazil, for example, who, while don't criminalize same-sex intimacy or have freedom of the press, still repress LGBTQI plus persons. And I also wanted to make a flag that democracies don't have perfect track records. If you're following the United States right now, there's really egregious laws that are being introduced. You can't say gay in Florida. There's a bill introduced in Texas trying to target trans people. So we have to look at kind of how regressive laws are trying to creep up to kind of limit LGBT rights, and LGBT rights are not guaranteed. I do say that the focus on marriage equality, while important, I think set a false source of security around what it meant for LGBT plus persons to be free. In response to your question. Yeah, the right to asylum, again, as I mentioned before, is guaranteed under the convention, but it's governments actively try to prevent people from claiming that right to asylum. The law in the UK is like comically bad, and I think that's intentional, right? It's no way that's going to pass, but the idea of it being introduced was to try to disincentivize people to acknowledge the universal right to asylum. I know we have 1 minute, so I want to make sure we have time for more questions.
We have maybe 2 more questions. So yeah.
So we talked a lot today about the formal institutions that are discriminating against queer people, but even if the laws change tomorrow, what does that, what will that do to society? What does that mean for your work? Does that still grant these people asylum? Even if they won't be sentenced to death, that doesn't mean that they won't be experiencing horrific backlash or being targeted, so forth.
The question is up there. Maybe we take 3 questions.
2 more? Yeah.
Okay. I feel like Ellen. So who's the... Sorry.
So I didn't quite understand that when the video were talking about being outed by tabloid press and that they said that people were murdered. Could you mind explaining that a bit for me?
Sure, I'll start answering while you do your great work. I'll answer that question. Yeah, so one of the drivers for LGBTQI plus forced displacement is not necessarily just being imprisoned, right? So individuals are outed, and they're usually outed publicly. And what that public outing, like in Uganda, there's literally a magazine called the Rolling Stone. That's the name of the magazine that put LGBTQI plus persons on the front page and just plastered them. And so once you're outed from your family or community, that you usually are disowned, you're kicked out, you lose lack of employment, and that's how displacement works in your community. So when people raided that LGBT center, they also released it to the press, and so they were outed in front of the entire community. So that's exactly what happened there. To answer your question, and an outcome for everyone here is that LGBTQI rights should be in solidarity with the global human rights movement, right? Because forced displacement, 90 million people are displaced. That number is only going to increase. What we're seeing in Ukraine right now is the fastest exodus of people in our lifetime, right? Syria was the largest forced displacement of 6 million people. That's quickly going to be surpassed by Venezuela, which is not, but even by conflict, it was by humanitarian causes. And Ukraine, I think, about 4 million people were displaced over 5 weeks, right? So this trend's only going to continue. Why we need to be in solidarity with the global movement.
I'll have one more question. That's okay.
Sorry, is it working? Yeah. My question is, actually, I don't want to be picky, but seeing that error on the map, it scared me because I'm Iranian, and hearing all those stories and knowing the unfortunate situation of the Iranian LGBT community, this scares me because whenever I had a hope, it was the railroad. I recently found out that railroad is not helping Iranians anymore. I want to know if it's right. And the second, because the situation of the Iranian LGBT community, the only way they have to escape is to Turkey, in a country that UN also left them alone, and they don't have a right to work. They don't receive any help. They are being treated in a very homophobic way in a country that is not a supporter, and they get stuck there in a hell for like more than 6 years, and there's no way to go out. And who are these people? I understand the situation of many countries might be very important, as what you mentioned, what the media shows, but Ireza Fazeli Monfared, he was beheaded, and he had a ticket booked 3 days after his death to Turkey. They are escaping that situation. And not seeing this situation, it scares me. So my question is, what is the situation of the Iranian refugees in Turkey? Because I know you helped many of them, but hearing that here, that you are not doing anything for them anymore, it scares me, and then seeing that map. Thank you.
Okay, well,
thank you.
Sorry for the...
I'm sorry, just because we're out of time. Let's allow him to answer the other question, and then maybe we can have the conversation.
I'm sure. So just to be super clear, the map is accurate. There was a color coordination. So I'm sensing a bit of I'm not sure what, but let me be clear. The map, it's a map that was color. There was a color coordination error for this particular venue.
Today only.
Okay, great. To answer your question, I'm not sure what you heard, but that's incorrect. So one of the things I love about the work we're doing and the movement that we're creating is that individuals are rising up to try to help other people find pathways of safety. We have 10,000 requests for help this year, as a lot of people. And I think one of the things that's remarkable about doing this work right now is that we're doing it in the age of social media, where people are able to advocate for their own rights, and we see it all around the world. And again, as someone who's a person of color doing this work, I think it's immensely important. But I also think disinformation spreads in that same way. So we work in all areas of the globe. What you pointed to is a challenge we have with repressed regimes accepting LGBTQI+ refugees. So Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, they're all going to Turkey, trying to seek refuge, and governments, so the Canadian government, for example, that accepted hundreds and thousands of people from Turkey, shifted to help taking people during the Syrian crisis and further displace them. And so we have to work with all the tools we have, including the shifts in government policy. So I'm happy to talk with you more offline here, but to short answer your question is that I think it's remarkable that civil society is being asked to kind of carry water for governments who are failing to do their job. That's kind of where I want you to take away from this, is that there's 90 million people displaced. That number's only going to increase, but in 2021, the United States accepted 15,000 refugees. That was the number one, right? We should be, as an action, we should be calling on governments to do more, not necessarily pointing on civil society.
Thank you, Kimali.
Thank you.
I think we can continue the conversation after the session outside. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Two very interesting conversations for you here today in this session in the Financial Freedom track presented by CT, which we are grateful for. What a lot of people don't really think about in today's world is that everybody wants dollars around the world. Dollars are, for now, the most important money, and at the end of the day, if you think about the hierarchy of money, dollars are at their very top. And most people around the world don't have access to a good, strong fiat currency. A lot of people in countries that have collapsing currencies want dollars. As you've heard, some of them also want Bitcoin, but as we all know, Bitcoin is a volatile asset. It goes up and down in dollar terms all the time. So some of them also just want dollars, or they just want dollars. Americans have the privilege of having dollars, so why shouldn't Lebanese or Nigerians or Argentines have the privilege of having dollars? Technology has made that possible. The banking system had like a control over who got dollars and who didn't get dollars. So your nationality would prevent you from doing that. Today, I've talked to people who use stablecoins in everywhere from Palestine to Ukraine to Argentina to China. And guess what? Now they get to use dollars too, which is kind of only fair. So it's kind of interesting that we have this phenomenon of like rising use of dollar assets around the world outside of the control of the US banking system. So to talk about that, and especially the incredible explosion of growth in that area in emerging markets, we have three fantastic speakers. We have Paolo, who's the CTO of Tether, which is the most widely used stablecoin in the world. We have Iri from Helicarrier in Nigeria. She has a lot of experience running an exchange where, in a country of more than 200 people, where the most dominant cryptocurrency is actually Tether, is a stablecoin. And my friend Alejandro Machado, who has done a lot of work at the intersection of Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and humanitarianism over the last 5-6 years, and now works at BitRefill and has personally seen the power of stablecoins as someone who is originally from Venezuela. So it's my honor to have them join you, and welcome. Thank you very much.
So yeah, let's talk a bit about. Alex introduced the concept of stablecoins, which might seem like a daunting word, but it's actually something very simple. It's just dollars, digital dollars, that anyone can use. That's the way I describe it. Yeah. So why would someone need stablecoins? Let's maybe start with you, Paulo. What have you seen that makes you think that like a person could want to use this technology in particular?
Sure. So stablecoins were born in 2014 with Tether. So Tether was the first stablecoin on the market. The main reason to create that cryptocurrency pegged to the dollar was that in 2014 we had the initial raise of Bitcoin and of course it was kind of growing in adoption, and we had more traders joining the crypto markets and so on. But still, in order to access Bitcoin, you would need always to pass through a bank account. And many times back in 2014, and until recently, I would say, there was really a high likelihood that your bank account would be closed if you were touching even remotely Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So Tether was a way to offer an off-ramp and on-ramp solution and a really fast transaction system on the dollar. So dollar that would follow the same mechanics of Bitcoin, right? So it's a dollar, Tether is a dollar on a blockchain. So it started with that, and then eventually, with more the time was passing, it started growing extremely organically outside of the crypto industry. So we have seen actual entire countries starting to adopt Tether as one of their most popular payment systems. Why? Because in emerging markets, we are seeing, like in Turkey, in Argentina, their national currency is devaluating pretty quickly. In Turkey, in the last 12 to 18 months, their national currency, the Turkish lira, devaluated against the dollar by 50%. So imagine you work all the time, you have your job, you work. At the end of the year, your buying power compared to foreign countries has been, instead of increasing or having more buying power, is actually get cut in half. So that's something that push people to find alternatives. And yes, there are the cryptocurrencies are quite volatile, right? We have seen recently, especially recently in the last weeks, how it can go south. So stablecoins are actually for a Turkish person, but also someone in Argentina, are actually an hedge against the inflation in their own country. They're actually an investment. That is quite crazy, right? So we are used in Europe, in the US, we are used to use, you have euro, we are used to have the dollar, so they are quite easy to handle currencies, right? We can transact, we have great banking. But there are many places in the world, like in Latin America, in South America, in Turkey, in Asia, in Africa, you have really hard time to get access to a bank account. There are 2 billion people in the world that don't have the same level of accesses to bank accounts that others have, right? So, and it's not because they are bad people, it's just that they are too poor to have a bank account. That is even, is sad and crazy even to be said. Because the reason is that opening a bank account, maintaining the bank account is extremely expensive. Because the banks have a core banking system, have an infrastructure that is most of the time outdated, is built on COBOL, that is a programming language of 30 years ago, or is built on infrastructures that are extremely bureaucratic, slow. They need a lot of rubber and bands to be kept alive because they didn't renew themselves over the last 30, 40 years. And because they didn't have to renew themselves, right? There was no Bitcoin, right? No, in 2008, something changed and Bitcoin came. And now there are and blockchain came. And now these are all these new projects that are trying to eat a piece of the pie of the banking system. And stablecoins are one of those things. They can allow people to have a wallet on their phone and have their own small savings account in a digital form. And they can do small investments, they can do payments in a currency that is quite strong, right? The US dollar is the most protected currency in the world. It's the most ubiquitous currency in the world. So that's why stablecoins matter, right? So of course, stablecoins like Tether are no Bitcoin. There is nothing like Bitcoin. I just want to make sure that this message is passing to you. But at the same time, they have a great purpose. They have a great utility for all the many people that are, they might not believe in cryptocurrencies, but they need a hard, strong currency because their day-to-day life needs that, right? They need to protect their investment, they need to send their children to universities and so on, and their national currency does not allow that.
Thank you. I'm gonna talk with you now a little bit, Aria. What, in your experience, have you seen this demand for holding the dollar, right, in a digital form? And have you seen it particularly from people who have no interest in Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, but just as a way to hold a currency that is stronger, actually the strongest currency in the world right now, which is the dollar?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'll just echo everything Paulo has already said, in that in Nigeria, we suffer all the same issues, devaluing currency. I mean, back in 1985, the Naira, which is our local currency, was actually stronger than the dollar. And today, $1 will get you maybe like almost 600 Naira. And most of that depreciation has just come over the past, let's say, like 5 to 10 years. So it's been really, really scary. So people don't want to leave their money in Naira because if it's just sitting there in the bank, every single day that passes, people are losing their money. So stablecoins have actually been a really good alternative for people to actually use, because if you wanted to even have access to dollars in Nigeria, let's say you want to keep your money in Nigeria, but you want it to be in dollars, so you would try to open a USD denominated account. But there are so many issues with that because, one, it's not accessible to everyone, but two, there's so many different restrictions on it. Like, let's say you can only spend, if you have a dollar card, the restriction now is like you can probably spend $20 a month which is like completely ridiculous. What are you going to do with that? And it's actually not even unheard of for the government to, you know, wake up one day, or for you to wake up one day and find out that the government has just converted all your dollars into naira at whatever rate they choose. So keeping money or dollars in Nigeria is just not an option for most people. So most people will then try to say, okay, let's, you know, send my money abroad. Let me try and, you know, send it to a US bank account or something like that. And that is also incredibly difficult because, okay, how are you going to do that? First of all, there's obviously restrictions, like I already mentioned, but even if you wanted to use something like a TransferWise or a Western Union, they're pretty slow. The rates they give you are also going to be not that efficient, and they don't even always work. Like in some, I think TransferWise doesn't even really work with Nigeria anymore, so you don't really have any other options. And so people are now turning to stablecoins because this is a way for them to access dollars without having to go through the traditional system that doesn't really allow them to do that. So most people who, like you said, aren't even really that interested in Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general are very interested in stablecoins as a way to just, you know, have their money outside of the Nigerian financial system. Yeah. So yeah, we see a lot of that.
Yeah, no, I get it. As a Venezuelan, you know, it's very difficult to trust the institutions of my country to keep my money safe and to keep, you know, even, you know, my personal safety. You know, that the lack of institutions is a big problem, right? And so when I hold, like, if I'm lucky enough to hold a dollar account in the US, right? Most people don't have this privilege if they're from Venezuela or from Argentina or from Nigeria. I am going to need to trust the bank that is holding my money, right? So with stablecoins, how does this trust model work? Like, what do I need to trust when I am using a particular stablecoin? Because there's more than one. Even though they all, like 99% of the stablecoin volume in the world is tracking the US dollar. They're trying to be pegged to the US dollar because that's the currency with the most demand. But not all stablecoins are created equal, right? So can you tell me a bit about what you have observed at helicarrier companies about this demand for different stablecoins, and why do you think there's demand for one or the other?
Yeah, so for us at Helicarrier, we operate an exchange called Bitcoins, so people can trade in different currencies. And the two stable coins that we support are Tether, USDT, and then USDC. And we chose those because they were the most popular. They're the ones that people ask us for. And what we've seen is Tether in particular has been extremely popular because it was the first to be on the Tron network, which had a lot lower fees than, you know, the Ethereum network. So I think when people actually are choosing between, okay, which one they want to use, it's mostly about efficiency. It's mostly about what they're trying to achieve. So if people are saying, okay, they want to get dollars out of the country as quickly as possible, they're probably going to go with Tether.
Mm-hmm. And then now I want to raise the question to you, Paulo. How do we, if this is such a useful tool, to be able to take, to opt into the currency of your choice, no longer be bound by the Naira or the Argentinian peso or the Venezuelan Bolivar, but actually if I want to keep my money in dollars or a dollar IOU, I can do that now. So how do we show people that stablecoins are trustworthy, and how do we kind of govern the system in a way that is better than what governments have done so far? In a way that, you know, I can say, okay, I have this many dollars and I can trust that that's not going away.
I have only 30 minutes and 40 to answer that because it's going to be really long. But otherwise, so of course, this opens the question of what happened in the last 2 weeks, right? With also other stable coins like algorithmic stable coins that went down the toilet pretty quickly after the first attack, right? So I think that definitely the categorization of stablecoins is really important. You have algorithmic stablecoins, but actually you have then on the other side portfolio-backed stablecoins that have for the majority assets that track the US dollar, right? So if you need to pay back to people a dollar worth of money all the time, you need to have in your backing something that tracks the dollar. So one of the interesting things is that with Tether, actually, we proved that we were able to repay to whomever was withdrawing Tether from the stablecoin, we were able to process $7 billion in 48 hours of redemptions, right, without refusing a redemption. And over 7 days, pretty much, was the total amount is between 10.5, $11 billion. Now, the question is, and we could have gone farther than that, right? We had all the liquidity to keep going, right? So I always said to whoever was asking me, try us, right? So we can repay. And I know that really openly, I know that there was a lot of FUD, a lot of concerns in the past. But so Tether is actually the only single institution that publicly proved that it could process $7 billion in withdrawals in 2 days. Now the question is, which banking institution can do that, right? So if you go to your own country and ask to your bank, can you process, because $7 billion, pretty much 10% of Tether assets. Do you think that your bank can process 10% of withdrawals of the entirety of their assets in 2 days? I don't think so. So, and again, we could have gone farther than that. So that is the stability. So no other stablecoin, by the way, has been proven with this liquidity and with this speed and using the banking rails, right? So we, of course, this, I'm really pleased because, of course, there is, one thing is saying, well, we are backed and we have the money and we can do this and that. On the other thing is, suddenly, randomly, right, everything is crashing. There is a lot of concern. Terra, Luna, the entire ecosystem is losing billions, tens of billions of dollars, right? So it's been said that in just a few weeks, $1 trillion was wiped out from the crypto industry. And then, so every single customer is asking, okay, is all fine? And then you can prove it with facts. So we are not anymore at the stage where we have to say, okay, yeah, but we can do it. We proved that we could do it. We proved that the stablecoin, at least our stablecoin, is liquid, is safe, is fast, and it does everything that we said it could do.
Okay. Any last comments? We only have a few seconds left.
I see that it was going to be long.
A little bit more time.
I would just say that it's also the responsibility of people that run exchanges like us to make sure that we are listing, coins responsibly and doing our research before we actually offer it to just anyone. So.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well,
right on time.
Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. Thank you.
you know what he can see? What is he looking at? Check, check. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Anyone who came in late, there's a bunch of seats over here, so we can get comfy. I'm excited to present this session. We have one of the panelists is on video, so when he's talking, he'll be up on the screen. There is a big tension in, let's say, the Bitcoin community over the idea of a grassroots movement that's pushed up from the bottom by people versus let's say, imposing this on top of people from above. And I thought that this would be an interesting group to discuss this tension with. We have people here who use Bitcoin as a democratic tool of activism, and we also have someone who lives in a country where Bitcoin was imposed on him against his will. So I think this is going to be great. Thank you, Anita, for doing this for us. We've got 25 minutes, and we're going to get going. Thank you. And I wanted to thank Leonid, who's coming in by video. Leonid is one of the people who works most closely with Alexei Navalny in Russia and is one of the most prominent opposition figures in Russia. Very brave guy. We're honored to have him as well as the other speakers here. So take it away, Anita. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming to our very interesting discussion, I would say. It's called, Is Bitcoin Compatible with Democracy? And I'm starting with a short introduction of our panelists. Farida Naborema is a Togolese human rights activist and writer who has fought for democracy in Togo since she was a teenager, and she founded the Forum Must Go movement. Jaroslav Lichachevsky is a tech entrepreneur and member of the Belarusian diaspora. He's a co-founder of the Belarus Solidarity Foundation, which has been building a parallel digital state and economy to get rid of President Lukashenko. Then on screen, I hope we then have Leonid Volkov. He was just introduced by Alex Gladstein. And Nelson Roda, Salvadoran investigative journalist who has been covering the use of Bitcoin in El Salvador for the independent newspaper El Faro. Welcome. I'd like to start this discussion with the term democracy, which appeared first in Greek city-states, meaning rule of the people, in contrast to aristocracy, meaning rule of an elite. For me, and I think Bitcoin's philosophy is to be money from the people for the people, where consensus about changes is needed from all participants in the network, and it works without the need of intermediaries, which we could see as an elite. So, to start this discussion, please tell us what your personal experience in your life or in your country has been with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency so far in fighting for justice and human rights.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for having me. The reality of my country, Togo, is that we have been ruled by the same government since 1967, making us the oldest military regime in Africa, 55 years with the same family. And interestingly, our struggle for resistance in Togo started literally in 1962 when the Togolese government passed a bill, the parliament in December 1962, to create the Togolese independent currency, because as other 14 French colonial countries, we used the colonial currency. A month after that, President Olympio, who initiated the bill, was assassinated by former members of the French colonial army, who ended up ruling Togo for many decades. As a result, living in Togo, money has been at the center of our struggle for change, because literally us falling under dictatorship came from our decision to want to become monetarily independent from the colonial system. And under a dictatorial government, having a currency that is controlled by the state limits you in tremendous ways in terms of what you can do. You have activists' accounts being frozen. We currently have activists in Togo, and even regular citizens who were arrested and have spent years in prison and have been tortured simply because they donated money to citizens' movements or simply because they hosted people who came in town to protest against the government. So it came to a point where we needed an alternative in terms of finding the ways to raise resources without government scrutiny and ensuring the safety of those who want to support our struggle as activists. And this has led us to creating a program which aims at educating activists and journalists on alternative ways of raising funds using Bitcoin, which provides more anonymity and kind of like shoulders away from government control. Togo and the other 14 countries in the French colonial system all have to follow the same monetary policies that were created by the colonial institution. And in that specific sector, laws have been passed literally banning citizens from owning foreign currency. There's a maximum amount of currencies that you can legally have that is a non-CFA currency. You are not allowed to have a foreign currency account unless you have received specific authorization from the Minister of Commerce, and literally you have no chance of obtaining that if you are openly opposed to the government. And the CFA currency has lost over 200% of its value since the independence era, and as a result has increased poverty because people have lost more than double of their savings and resources and have found themselves in greater debt. So Bitcoin provides that better stability while allowing us to continue our struggle, but also help us find a different monetary system, as we hope that one day we can have state institutions that are accountable to us, because for now, the people of Togo have no say whatsoever in terms of our fiscal and monetary and financial policies.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, thank you. Jaroslav, please, your experience.
Yeah, I'm a techie guy with software engineering background from Belarus, but I'm not a crypto guy, I'm an AI guy. And back in times when we've been having fun on hackathons with the friends, I was quite skeptic about crypto and bitcoins and stuff. Okay, kids playing some coins, how it can hurt. Meanwhile, like we serious dudes, we do AI, machine learning, computer vision, detecting diseases, saving lives, and that kind of stuff. Before 2020 happened, when our political crisis escalated a lot, and like the political situation in Belarus is bad for almost 30 years, but 2020 went completely crazy. Lots of crackdown, lots of violence in the streets, 50,000 people in jail in Europe, can you imagine? And a huge need of supporting civil society and activists inside of the country. And we suddenly realized that the traditional financial system is 100% tracked and known by regime. All of the transactions, all of the assets, all of the accounts, everything. So they can freeze your funds any day of the week. They can take it. You can put you into the jail because you receive support from abroad. And that's the moment we start using crypto for transferring money. We established a foundation in Europe, in the Netherlands, been fundraising around the globe, and then we have to solve the problem how to transfer money safely to Belarus. Obviously, crypto was the first answer and the only answer at the moment.
Sorry.
But then it started evolving. So as it's going worse and worse in Belarus, sanctions applying, it all led to the war in Ukraine, and the economy is falling, less and less jobs, healthcare, education, everything goes down. We start building some services to empower people inside of the country. Like Lukashenko went a little bit crazy. He started firing hundreds of doctors. It's after COVID when hundreds already died. And that means lack of healthcare for people and no jobs for the doctors. We are building telemedicine platform. We're hiring them. We're providing healthcare to the country. The same with education and teachers. The same with legal system and lawyers. And we have to pay salaries to these people. we do our operations in Europe, and when we have to build a financial system, right? On top of the services, we have a parallel economy growing. That means at a certain point, we can enable taxation within our digital country. We have taxation, we have to bring representation and build digital democracy. And for all of this, we need our own independent, secure financial system. And that's where we can't rely on traditional banks, we can't rely on existing financial system, we have to build our own, and that's where crypto is golden for us and where it's bring new dimension of freedom.
Okay, super. Leonid Volkov, you're the chief of staff for Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who was sentenced to 9 years in prison in March. Can you tell us from your experience how Bitcoin and cryptocurrency has helped you, or how is it supporting democracy?
Well, first of all, I have to notice that my point of view is just point of view of a user. So we didn't build a lot of theory about it. We just have a lot of practice. Our movement, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, has always been run on crowdfunding. We always relied on crowdfunding since the very inception of the Anti-Corruption Foundation back in 2011. In 2013, we crowdfunded Alexei Navalny's mayoral campaign. And in 2016, when he decided he will run for president, we just started also a Bitcoin wallet as one of the means of crowdfunding, as one of the means for support for our movement. This Bitcoin wallet is still active. So we use actually like the same public wallet we launched in 2016. So for 6 years now, its turnaround altogether was 675 Bitcoins over the 6 years. Unfortunately, most of them in the times when the exchange rate was much smaller than now. So we used it only very transactional. So the idea was like to have a spare channel of crowdfunding, because otherwise, normally people would donate using like, well, regular bank accounts, regular debit cards inside the country, which is of course very vulnerable to the authorities. Of course, it was very clear for us that authorities at any moment of time can just switch it off. The idea that we have Bitcoin as an additional tool of collecting donations was our plan B. They knew that we have Bitcoin, so they knew that actually if they decide to switch our regular donations off, which they were able to do at any moment, well, more of our donors, more of our supporters would switch to Bitcoin, which will make them actually like less visible, less understandable to the government. So while our Bitcoin donations were never, in no single year, there were more than 10% of our total donations, still the fact that this channel of donations existed was a very good insurance for our whole crowdfunding campaign. Well, lately, after the events of April 2021, when our movement has been recognized an extremist movement in Russia, when we have been outlawed, and when we forced to relocate, when we were forced to relocate abroad, and when crowdfunding inside the country became impossible, suddenly we realized that Bitcoin is also very important, because we still can use it to support our friends and colleagues back there in Russia. Otherwise, it would be just too dangerous for them. They can't like accept payments from us, the terrorists, because we are pretty much on the same list as like Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Russia now. So in this regard, yes, of course, Bitcoin still is a very important payment tool for us, but we don't have any specific philosophy about it. It's just like a very useful, reliable payment tool. That's our experience of using it.
Okay, thank you. So now we heard a lot of positive things about Bitcoin, and now I want Nelson to add his opinion, seeing it like from another perspective, because all of these movements are basically activist movements, resistance movements, grassroots movement, but in El Salvador it has been quite different.
Yeah, so it shouldn't be surprising to tell Bitcoiners not to trust a government, but that's what I'm here for. The problem for me is to believe in a government that promises financial freedom while cracking down on press freedom. And I can't believe, and you shouldn't either, in a president that talks about orange pills and laser eyes well, me and other 25 journalists were infected with the Pegasus spyware in this phone from El Faro, where I work, 22, and Gato Encerrado, 3 other journalists. I have find it hard to believe in Bitcoin's theology of liberation, while the government that preaches it also boasts the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world. 30,000 people, close to 30,000 people have been arrested in the last 2 months because of Bukele's alleged crackdown on gangs, but there's hundreds of denounces of arbitrary detentions. And as a Cuban friend told us yesterday, there can be neither prosperity nor freedom to create in any sphere of society without political freedom. So what I'm saying is that Bukele has weaponized Bitcoiners and their tweets to whitewash himself and the crooked actions of his government. Just last week, we published audios from one of Bukele's top officers confirming the negotiations with gangs. You can Google Nayib Bukele Batman, because Batman was his code name in these negotiations. We published the audios. And he didn't respond. Instead, what did Bukele do? He tweeted about Bitcoin. So this is what he has done. And as Anita was saying, the Salvadoran Bitcoin experience has been, and is paradoxical. It's imposed from the top down. It's not grassroots based. A December national poll revealed that only 10% people believe that the main beneficiaries of the Bitcoin law, which turns a year next week, are the people, while 80% believes that either the rich, foreign investors, banks, businessmen, or the government are the main beneficiaries. So yeah, there's a distinct element in the conversation.
Okay, but is it like, I mean, Bitcoin is a technology. You can use it for bad and for good. Can you see that also? Of
course, I think as payment rail as a payment rail, it has possibilities. What I'm saying is that it's not being used like that in El Salvador. When people like to say El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, did we really? Because it's not accepted. Go in El Salvador and go into the streets and ask businesses, not Starbucks or Pizza Hut or whatever. Go to the streets and see if people are taking it, because they are not taking it. We're talking about a highly popular president. Authoritarian regimes can be popular too. Two things can be true. So highly popular president, 80% rates of approval. And Bitcoin was his first unpopular movement. The first broad protests in the streets against Bukele were on September 15, a week later after the Bitcoin, because the main thing that people got from the Bitcoin law is its volatility. So people were afraid that we are on the dollar since 2001. We are a dollarized country. So people were afraid with Bitcoin that they would lose money, they would lose their value of their money overnight, because Bitcoin's the price tends to go up and down. So that is my point.
But isn't it also a lack of education that's the problem, what the problem is?
I think there's a different conversation in whether you believe Bitcoin will be sustainable at the long term, which is also a question. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people think that. I think that's a question to raise. And certainly there's an education element. The government hasn't given education. The Chivo wallet is essentially, the national wallet is essentially a surveillance tool, as I see it, because it's centralized. It's not a decentralized wallet, so the government can actually see every transaction that you do, which is kind of antithetical to Bitcoin. Also dismantling democracy. In El Salvador, there's no separation of powers, no rule of law. President changed the constitutional court, and then constitutional court changed what the constitution says to allow Bukele to go for re-election in 2024. This is our all. I don't believe in a tool for financial freedom if that's the only freedom that we're going to have.
Do you want to say?
Yes.
Thank you.
He makes a great point in terms of highlighting how authoritarian governments are really good with hijacking popular campaigns and initiatives in order to portray themselves as being progressive. Like you have experienced similar things in other sectors where you will have an authoritarian government trying to change the constitution because their ultimate goal is to run for another term, but while giving the impression that they actually changed the constitution because they want to promote women's rights. Now, you protesting against that constitutional change is going to appear as you being against women's rights, but when their real agenda is something other than that. The same for Bitcoin. At the end of the day, Bitcoin is like religion, it is something that people adopt and adapt to their lives to improve their financial situations and to have access to financial systems that they initially have been excluded out of. But when it is something that is done from top to the bottom and it is imposed on people without their consent and without taking into consideration their specific needs and problems, then you will end up creating a monster and frustrating the masses. And it defeats the whole purpose of Bitcoin. The idea of Bitcoin is to have people use it as a currency without the control of institutions, existing institutions. And now when you have governments that do not represent the people, cannot be held accountable because they are not democratic, that are using Bitcoin to promote a narrative, when in turn they are still abusing civic rights, preventing citizens from having a say in the way they manage the state funding, Bitcoin will not solve that problem. Bitcoin remains a tool to help those who are fighting against people who are trying to oppress the masses at the end of the day. So for me, this El Salvadoran approach wouldn't be ideal, especially for countries that are ruled by authoritarian governments, because there is no trust that exists between the masses and the government. And when the people do not trust the government, they can bring them gold, they will still be doubtful to use it, and they will have resentments because they still have struggles. And before you think about a saving in Bitcoin or putting your money in Bitcoin, you should afford 2 meals a day or 3 meals a day, which may not be the reality of countless of young people and in these situations who are living in very extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm. Jaroslav, I think you have been discussing with Nelson a little bit today. Do you want to add something?
Yes, I do. Nelson making a great point, but what I have to say that any system or any technology can be used by authoritarian countries or dictators only if it's isolated from the rest of the world. Let's take internet. It works perfectly for Chinese government because they managed to isolate it from the rest of the world. For Belarusian dictator or for Russian dictator, internet is a disaster, because it allows to get free information from different sources. Of course, they're trying to abuse it and they're trying to build their own propaganda, but unless it's the closed environment, it's killing them, not helping them. The same here is with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not isolated from the rest of the world. It opens an economy, global economy for you. It enables lots of stuff and lots of processes for you. So they're just letting a gene out of the bottle. And you have to say your wishes to this gene.
Do you want to answer?
I mean, sure, I think it's just, for me, the benefits of Bitcoin are still pretty much theoretical in El Salvador and not actually translated to reality. It's been a year from the Bitcoin law, which was announced by Mr. Jack Mallers in a conference in Miami last year. And so what was promised to us was development, tourism, and a reduction of fees of remittances. Remittances are amount to like 20% of El Salvador's GDP because we're 6 million people and 3 million live abroad, so 9 million. And the reality is that people are not catching up because the government launched a national wallet, it flopped. So people lost confidence. If you lose money, are you going to keep throwing money? Like, if you lose $50, it might not be a lot, but El Salvadoran average wage for a month is like $360. So it's a lot of money for some people. So what I'm saying is that so Bitcoin is, it has roots in the cypherpunk movement, right? And it was created by people like Phil Zimmerman, who was an activist persecuted by the government. How has this changed to millionaires running around in helicopters, in military helicopters in El Salvador, going to know this supposedly Wakanda city that's going to be built, the Bitcoin city, into this kind of crypto dystopia. So that doesn't make sense for me. I was last week in the house of a fisherman in this a township called El Condadillo in La Unión, and it's a really beautiful house in the outskirts and in the countryside, and he's really he's being displaced, and the community is being displaced to build an airport that's going to support the Bitcoin city. And so for him, Bitcoin is not, Practically, it can have benefits in the future, but for these persons in El Condadillo, it's their township being erased.
Leonid Volkov, are you still around?
Yeah, I just get a minute maybe, then I have to run. I'm sorry,
so, but we ran out of time, but 1 minute, please.
So I just want to say that this testimony from El Salvador is actually very insightful. I never.
Always.
Wow.
Wait 30 seconds. Okay, so a short round at the end. What's your message to our audience today about Bitcoin and democracy?
I will say that countless people across the world where states have failed them and institutions have failed them are still looking at Bitcoin as a way to support their struggle. It doesn't mean Bitcoin is solving the problem or is doing the fight for us. It is a tool in reinforcing the fight that we have been leading for decades. So do not turn a blind eye on it. And of course, it comes with some skepticism around it. But I believe that each situation is different. And when you grow up in countries where you literally have lost hope over decades about change, any little thing that can give you hope and help you improve your struggle should be a welcome improvement. And I always say, do not hate what you don't understand. Just try to do more research and try to see how you can make it work for you.
Yes, Anita, I would like to refer to what you started with about the democracy itself. So, democracy is where power grows from people. And the golden rule of the democracy is 2 people can steal less than 1, 3 can steal less than 2, 4 can steal less than 3, and so on and so forth. So when we are dealing with a traditional financial system, you can bribe just a couple of corrupted bankiers and do wash whatever money you want. With a Bitcoin, when it's controlled by all of the network and it's controlled by all of the people, all of the citizens included there, that's some kind of financial democracy probably we're seeking for. So yeah, I'm a tech guy. I'm fancy of the technologies, and I will encourage all of you to try it because it could be really useful. It could be scary. It could go the wrong way, but if we do everything right, it will serve us very good.
So if you believe in Bitcoin, you can cheer on the president and on the government giving Salvadorans this tool for financial freedom and still call on to him to respect democracy, rule of law, separation of powers, freedom press, and all of the other freedoms that human beings need.
Thank you.
He said that your testimony, Nelson, was very powerful and insightful, and the same So thank you all for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
together, you know?
I can usher people for you. Hello. IDs. How are you? IDs and Bitcoin people?
Yeah, is your talk happening right now?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
You need him to help, huh? Yeah. But I encourage them to stay.
we'll still be
Like to have them watch.
No. They're going to be talking about Bitcoin outside.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm sure a lot of these people will stay.
Okay. Yes. So for this, in case there's a Q&A, I can but we don't need the mic right now. Okay. But there's a Zoom, obviously.
Yep.
Person adding.
Okay.
Okay. And then, hold on. I think the best, Nick, if you'd like, you guys can sit over here. I think it might be the best view. Right. Hello, hello, hello. Hi.
Are they just taking a really long time to get out of here?
Yeah.
Can I just say something?
I want people to stay. Are there people?
I think we can make it semicircle. I think that would be better, right?
Like a semicircle?
Yeah, like a little curving. What do you think,
I
Leonardo?
just don't know with the cameras. Or well, we can come in a little bit
We can
closer.
curve a little.
Yeah.
Curve.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to be here and having this panel discussion. Just a brief introduction to myself before we move on to the incredible panelists that are with me. So my name is Amy Ray. I am the Managing Director of North America for the Freedom Fund. We are a global NGO working to end modern slavery. We do so through identifying and investing in the most impactful frontline organizations. And when I say invest in, I mean that both financially and in supporting them in scaling and in networking with one another. I also just want to take a moment to define what we mean when we talk about modern slavery, because we are talking about modern slavery today. So when we use that term, think about things that are that qualify under extreme exploitation. So that means labor trafficking, sex trafficking, forced labor, child labor, bonded labor, state-mandated forced labor, and forced marriage. So today I have the honor of being joined by some incredible panelists, and we are here to talk about the intersection of authoritarian regimes and modern slavery, because these two things are both systems that impede personal freedoms. And we think it's really important to highlight both the history and where we're at and how we've gotten to this place. So I will be the moderator today, and we'll take you through a bit of discussion, and then we'll try to have a few minutes for Q&A, but if we don't get those few minutes, you can always talk to us afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hand off to each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Jessie Brunner, who is on screen to introduce herself. Hi, Jessie.
Hey, Amy, thank you so much. I hope you all can hear me okay. I'm so sorry that I'm not there in person, in part because I'd much rather you see my face at its normal size and not at this giant size. But I unfortunately am ill and stuck in Iceland. Not the worst place to be stuck, definitely, but close, so close and yet far. So I'm Jessie Brunner. I'm the Associate Director and Director of Human Trafficking Research at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University. I've been researching issues related to those you just highlighted, Amy, human trafficking, modern slavery, severe labor exploitation for about a decade. And I was really initially drawn into this space to better understand conversations around the lack of data that we had to understand the problem. And that really helped me understand that a lot of the time, it was more that we weren't asking the right questions as a field, as much as we didn't have the necessary information to answer those questions. So I come at this work with a pretty interdisciplinary background. I actually started as a journalist, and then did my graduate work at Stanford in international policy. So I bring a lot of broad social sciences, and really I consider myself a generalist who's striving to make connections across disparate disciplines and different areas of expertise. So I've long been engaged with the international anti-trafficking community at a policy level, including doing research in various parts of Southeast Asia and Brazil, and really just trying to understand how this kind of exploitation plays out in different places and how different governments, civil society organizations, private sectors, et cetera, try to handle it. And with that, I'll kick it to the next panelist.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse. And if I can pass over to Philmon.
Hi, my name is Philmon Dobro. I'm an Eritrean refugee who lives in Germany currently. By profession, I am a software developer, but given the opportunity, I would invest my time to oppose the dictatorial regime we have through interviews and protests, and hope and work to the day we get rid of this regime, ISIS regime in Eritrea.
Great, thank you so much, Philmon. And Leonardo.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here. My name is Leonardo Sakamoto. I'm a journalist, I'm a political scientist. I'm professor of journalism in the Catholic University of São Paulo, Brazil. I'm Brazilian. Don't look like, but I'm Brazilian. But who is Brazilian? Brazilian doesn't look like Brazilian. And, well, sorry. Well, I'm the general director of the NGO Reporter Brazil that was founded in 2001 by investigative journalists. And our specialty is tracking down supply chains, is discover who is responsible for slave labor in human trafficking. Since 2001, we tracked more than 2,000 supply chains showing that goods produced with slavery, human trafficking, environmental damage, traditional community attacks is directly connected with the national and international market. And between 2014 and 2020, I was trustee on the board of the United Nations Fund for Contemporary Forms of Slavery. Talking about slavery, it's interesting to say that Brazil was considered one of the reference in the fight against slavery worldwide. We released, the Brazilian government, the task forces of Brazilian government released more than 58,000 workers since 1995. I said was because now we are under the government of President Jair Bolsonaro. I believe that you heard this name several times. He's destroying the future of everybody. And this is complicated because he's changing this proeminence that Brazil had in the fight against slavery, not the fight against slavery just, but the environment and so on. And now we are facing tough times.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. So I want to start us out with more of a big picture, and I want to start by asking you a question, Jesse. So with your researcher hat on, when we look across the world and across history, I'd love to hear from you what the relationship is between authoritarian regimes and modern slavery, and also how can authoritarianism encourage or likewise inhibit attempts at addressing human trafficking and forced labor?
Thanks, Amy. So when I hear this question, I think a lot about what are the elements that really define and foster authoritarianism, and how do those map on to what we believe to be the drivers of modern slavery and similar forms of exploitation. So sort of the list that I come up with that I think is pretty well agreed on is usually intense civil or interstate conflict, low economic development or GDP, weak institutions, high levels of corruption, and restrictions on press and or weakened civil society. So if we then look at the top 10 countries with regard to prevalence of modern slavery, according to the latest statistics from Walk Free, we will note that these are all authoritarian regimes. We have places like North Korea, Central African Republic, Mauritania, Pakistan, Cambodia, Iran, etc. So the other thing we note about these places, though, in addition to them being authoritarian, is that they're also largely marked by civil conflict. So it's not surprising that in the case of conflict, we're going to see other challenges emerge when you have such a disruption to, or maybe even a complete dismantling of the rule of law, as well as maybe physical damage to critical infrastructure, limited access to education, healthcare, food and water, etc. Similarly, when we try to understand what are seen as the drivers or push and pull factors of human trafficking and similar exploitation, we see a lot of these same issues: corruption, poverty, conflict. And so it really makes sense that we see a connection there between authoritarianism and this exploitation. For example, we see these conditions coming together in especially devastating ways in places like Eritrea, which I'm sure Filman will discuss in more detail shortly. Eritrea happens to rank very low, if not the lowest, on various sort of rankings of democratic governments. But obviously, not all those conditions are going to be met in the case of every autocracy. We have notably the wealthy Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar that don't suffer from the low GDP issue, but still have significant issues with human trafficking. We also might have authoritarian or authoritarian leaning states that have very strong government institutions, but it's really just a matter of what leadership wants to prioritize and what issues they're using their political will towards combating. So, I mean, strong governments can actually create a lot of problems, say, in really limiting migration in ways that is discriminatory or makes it difficult to find safe working conditions, again, restricting the press or surveilling their citizenry. This can go all the way into sort of state-imposed forced labor, as we see prominently in places like North Korea and China. We've heard a lot, I think, lately in the international community about the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example. But likewise, if we look at China, we've seen how, in some ways, those strong institutions that the West might consider normatively weak have actually proven functionally strong with regard to, say, encouraging economic development, which has lifted millions of people out of poverty, which we could see as positive in discouraging modern slavery, but at the same time, again, can be used in ways that are very repressive to the population, such as really heavy deprivations of privacy related to surveillance, which then affects people's access to services. Similarly, in a place like Cambodia, we can have really effective anti-trafficking advocates high up in the government, such as with the head of the Ministry of the Interior now. But unfortunately, her linkage to the government of Hun Sen means that civil society engagement on these issues with the government is really limited out of fear of working alongside that very repressive government, especially if it touches really hot button issues such as land reform or land use. So I know the Human Rights Foundation has looked at this correlation, this relationship between authoritarianism and trafficking by analyzing the US government's annual TIP report and noting that those that rank well, so tier 1 countries, have democratic governments most of the time, and conversely, those that rank lowest are more likely to be authoritarianism. And again, that linkage definitely makes sense, but I think it has more to do with vulnerability to trafficking than prevalence of trafficking. So when I looked at those numbers that I mentioned, the prevalence numbers from Walk Free, as well as their vulnerability indices, and this is Walk Free and ILO, I should note, as well as their vulnerability indices, and put those against rankings on democracy from organizations like Freedom House or VDEM, you can see that there's actually a stronger correlation between vulnerability scores than there is between prevalence. And so that's why I think we see that intersection between the push factors of authoritarianism and trafficking. And just to sort of summarize, I think it's important to think about how each of those things that we see are limited in authoritarian states could act as checks on curbing the issue of trafficking if they were allowed. So freedom of the press, for example. I think a lot of people were really compelled by the series of reports that came out in 2015 about forced labor in fisheries and shrimp processing in particular, and that really galvanized a lot of movement and attention across government and the private sector towards combating these issues, for example. So that's where we see if press freedom is limited, we're going to also have limits to how we can combat trafficking. Similarly, limitations on civil society. These are key actors, people like those on the stage now who are holding governments accountable for filling gaps in social services that act as protective factors towards populations and ensure that there's a multiplicity of services available for survivors, for example. Again, where there's conflict, we touched on this before, that creates chaos, limitations to bureaucracy. There certainly are going to be in and out groups, most likely, and that can really, when those things aren't curbed, then that can really encourage the kinds of exploitation we see. With low GDP or weak institutions, we have, again, those lack of social services or protective factors that can really work to combat inequities across society. And obviously, if people have better economic opportunities where they are, they can stay there and work, hopefully in safer conditions, in a comfortable environment near their families, where they're not needing to battle uncertainties around social norms, et cetera. And then obviously with corruption, this is a huge one. We can have the most excellent counter-trafficking policies, but if the day-to-day operations are not mirroring those policies, which is always going to be a challenge because there's money to be made, then we're going to continue to see these problems.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jessie, for taking us through, I think, the broadest question that we have, really making those linkages between how authoritarianism really encourages modern slavery and how those vulnerabilities are really created and given life in authoritarian regimes, whether or not the modern slavery starts to pick up. So I'd like to take us from the bigger picture down to a more personal experience. And Philmon, I'd love if you could tell us a bit about your experience and the role of the Eritrean government in exploiting its citizens.
Yeah, perhaps to explain this, and even to explain the cause, the population, we are to blame partly, because we gave this government, this regime in the beginning, blind trust and blind loyalty, since the same party that brought independence after 100 years of colonization, this guy, Isaias Afwerki, was not seen as a person, he was seen as a hero, as an angel, like God sent from the sky. So whatever he did was deemed to be the right thing to do. There were signs in the beginning that people could have woken up from, but we could not imagine that he could even turn up a dictator one day. So when this forced labor, in the beginning they called it Wafri Warsaikalo, or let's call it national service. When it started, it was for a limited period of time. And what you did was, after military training, your work was usually helping parents of martyrs that fell during the War of Independence, or irrigation ones that would help against erosion, or building bridges for your nation. But using the war with Ethiopia as an excuse, this was extended indefinitely. And types of activities you do went from something noble into something, I would call it, enriching a few individuals. Like you would work on some rich person's farm. That person certainly does not need help in his farm. You would work in the gold mines. You would build homes for someone you don't know. A person that can afford a villa does not really need free labor. And with this, they have full control in the country, and there is nothing you can do about it. If you try, you will follow the lead of those who went before you. The country is filled more with underground prisons than schools. most of the time, let alone knowing if a person is alive or dead. You don't even know which prison he went to initially, let alone after. And with this, they managed to exploit the entire nation's man wealth without even hope for a change from within, because they have been also systematically destroying the educational system, because they do not want an educated person. What they want is a sir, yes sir type of man, a blank shell of a person that needs guidance from above, a hierarchical guidance just to do basic daily activities. And to some extent, what scares me is that they have been succeeding in this.
Thank you for that. That's really powerful, and I think that underscoring of the amount of fear and control and how that plays into maintaining control of individuals, maintaining control of an entire nation through fear of all of the underground prisons, through fear of what happens to you. And that's what we know to be true of slavery that we've learned about the transatlantic slave trade, or any of the slavery that's persisted into today that has its links into that. So thank you for sharing that. Leonardo, we'd love to hear from you about the authoritarianism, the legacy of authoritarianism that lingers even after a shift to democracy. So Brazil transitioned to democracy in the mid-1980s, and yeah, I'd love to hear what the legacy is of authoritarianism, of forced labor in your country.
Well, thank you for the question. I will follow the script because I talk so much, and then 4 minutes will not enough to answer that. And well, sorry for that. But it's impossible to understand the violence involved in the process of enslavement of rural workers in Brazilian Amazon without understanding the role of military dictatorship that ruled the country between 1964 and 1985. Forced labor was widely used as an instrument for the occupation of the Amazon in an effort led by economic and political powers at that time. Although there are no official figures, researchers estimate that up to 500,000 workers were subjected to debit bondage in that period there in Amazon. The military dictatorship justified its actions by claiming that if Amazon were not occupied, the region would be transformed into an independent country by the invasion of rich nations. This same paranoia is reiterated today by President Jair Bolsonaro, who considers himself a direct heir to the dictatorship period. In truth, the dictatorship wanted to usher capital and ally in the 1964 coup d'etat to explore the region. In order to do so, it needed first to ensure that cheap labor was available there. Therefore, Brazilian authoritarian government implemented a policy to deliberately provoke a migratory flow into the area, into Amazon. The working poor were told that a new El Dorado was be found in the middle of the jungle, only to become cheap labor for the large farms and large plants and large mineral extractive projects. In fact, when this new workforce arrived, they were placed in small settlements without any support to produce, leaving them no option but work for other people, sometimes for free. During the dictatorship, the government systematically censored slave labor complaints, of which there were many. In the 1970s, the Catholic Church managed to bring accusations here to Europe about slavery on a farm belonging to the German company Volkswagen in the South Amazon. This was the first case of slavery in Brazil that managed to break through the censorship and gain international repercussion. This standard of behavior prevalent in the dictatorship continues this day, not only in the Amazon, but in also the rest of the country. There is an anachronistic portion of rural producers with strong representation in Brazilian parliament that still dominated their region's politics. As a result, they were largely free to act in any way they see fit to protect their interests. For example, I have interviewed some workers over a course of a rescue operation in Amazon some years ago. They said to me they have been living in a settlement, but because the government never provided resources and infrastructure, the solution was to seek work in deforestation on a farm, where they subsequently been enslaved. The violent model provided by the dictatorship, where no decision was ever questioned, has been followed for decades in Amazon. There are stories of workers who were afraid to flee the farms and report the slavery to the local police because policemen working for the farms would bring the fugitive back. Today, this violence is felt through the blurring in the line between public and private spheres in the region of Amazon to ensure the rights of big business and to restrict those of workers.
Thank you so much for that. And that really speaks to the linkage of profit for companies, for the private sector, also for political regimes, and how that plays its part in the violence and the force that's used to get people to work for them for free in order to maintain that profit. So Jesse, forced labor is by no means unique to authoritarian countries. And I'd love to hear from you, why is it, and in what ways do we likewise see modern slavery occurring in democratic countries?
Thanks, Amy. I think this question really forces us to remember that the issues that we're talking about revolve around inequities in power structures, meaning that certain groups of people are choosing to wield their position of authority or power in a way that abuses or exploits another person's rights and freedoms. And those power structures are not just political. They can be social, cultural, religious, economic, etc. We must also remember that the proliferation of democracy across the globe, seen as a more legitimate and representative form of government, excuse me, has in a lot of cases not been accompanied by meaningful efforts to actually tackle the challenges that it takes to be a democratic country, such as those tensions between equality and liberty, the tyranny of the majority, and just sort of the general overwhelm of the political process that can take place amongst the populace, whether that's genuine or manufactured. And I think, as Leonardo really perfectly encapsulated, when countries transition from authoritarianism towards democracy, that process is very complicated and often prolonged and marked by ebbs and flows of progress and backsliding. And I think we've seen a number of examples of that over the last few years. The US is certainly not an exception here, but we look to places like Myanmar, Ethiopia, or Afghanistan, for example, which I think a lot of folks have been thinking about, particularly recently. But I'd like to draw on a quote here from W.B. Du Bois, who reminded us that, quote, "a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect." And I realize that the premise of this panel is when systems fail, but I also think we need to consider the idea of what happens when systems work. But those systems enshrine discriminatory policies that can facilitate or even encourage various forms of modern slavery, including forced labor. And I'd really like to just shout out Freedom Fund, Amy, and I also saw your colleague Nick there earlier, because I think you as an organization are really doing work that looks at those systems that allow slavery to persist and thrive. But here at the moment, I'm thinking about countries that often score highest on some of those rankings I mentioned earlier in terms of consolidated liberal democracies, and lowest with regard to prevalence of trafficking or vulnerability to modern slavery. These are generally wealthy countries marked by generally peace and strong institutions, relatively free press and a vibrant civil society, strong political will, high levels of resources, etc., including to respond to modern slavery. But the reality is that the prevalence of modern slavery in these highly developed, high-income countries is higher than I think we previously believed. And this is where we really get back to those power structures. Perhaps it's not the government in the ways we discussed earlier when talking about authoritarian regimes, but it could certainly be argued that the allegiances that we see between, say, industry and politics via billions of dollars spent annually on lobbying, for example, is simply a higher form of corruption that we can't necessarily divorce from these realities of exploitation. I'm thinking here, how might we compare the outsourcing of electronics below the cost of production to factories in Malaysia, where they can't possibly afford safe working conditions and decent wages when you're not even paying the full cost that it takes to produce a good? How does that compare with the case of, say, a police officer in Cambodia who accepts a kickback from a local criminal network to turn a blind eye to a situation of exploitation of this sort? Though, to be honest, I've seen plenty of cases in Cambodia where the actual issue is that police officers have to pay for their own fuel in order to do investigations, which is obviously a large disincentive for chasing down complex cases. So I think we need to take these kinds of things into consideration. I mentioned the Uyghurs in China earlier, but the forced labor that the Uyghurs have been linked to is in supply chains of the most prominent brands in the world. And I think Leonardo made this point great in the case of the Brazilian Amazon and exploitation there. But we see goods produced by Uyghur forced labor being sold by companies like Adidas, Amazon, H&M, Coca-Cola. And obviously we don't have to look far when we wonder where these companies and most of their consumers are based. And this ties a lot into the work that me and my colleagues with the Restructure Lab have been doing over the past several years, where we really try to look at key trends that are especially apparent in the United States, but elsewhere in the global economy as well, that really all but ensure that exploitation is a feature, not a bug, of the modern economy. So we think of the financialization of the economy, for example, which means that global economic activity is increasingly centered on financial activities such as stock buybacks, as opposed to productive activities that might ensure fair wages for workers or safe working environments. We see a significant uptick in market concentration and troubling limitations on labor organizing, for example. And as I already mentioned in the example, there's a lot more outsourcing and subcontracting happening. And when we shift production of goods to geographies that are known to have weaker legal frameworks, lower wages, and poorer enforcement of labor standards, that basically is just opening up access to new populations of workers that are easily exploited, and thus exacerbates the problems that we're talking about today. Just because we're moving the problem offshore doesn't make any of the actors in that chain, including people like me as a consumer, any less complicit. And then, of course, we can't ignore history. You mentioned, Amy, for example, the transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, in the US, we celebrate often a lot of our founding virtues of democracy and equality and freedom, but it's no news to anyone here. I don't think that those benefits, when they were proclaimed, were meant really to only extend to a few privileged folks. And despite significant legal progress, and I don't want to undermine that, it is significant with regards to, say, civil rights for women and people of color or other minoritized populations. At each step in our history, we've often still found and find ways to justify continued unequal treatment. For example, the abolition of slavery that came with the 13th Amendment to our Constitution made an exception for prison labor, which then devolved into prison privatization and convict leasing, which is just a new form of capitalizing the human body to the benefit not only of private companies such as railroads and mines, but the state itself. So in the case of prison lease, convict leasing, states were making money off this. For example, the state of Tennessee once made 10% of its state budget from the practice. Maybe today this is turned into other forms of exploitation, such as research that shows that Communities that are located near highly pollutant factories, for example, are much more likely to be poor and have a much higher concentration of people of color and a much lower life expectancy, in numbers of years lower. So in a lot of ways, we're essentially still taking people's time and health so that someone else can make money. And I just think that this kind of abuse would simply not be possible if we somehow still didn't see others as less human and thus exploitable. McKinney, Chisholm, Stryker, and Catherine Chan, I think, really capture this final point well in a book they released as editors last year on the historical roots of trafficking, in which they reminded us that the full problem of modern slavery and trafficking includes an ignorance of foul truths, an unwillingness of those with privilege and power to openly confront national and individual complicity in this reality, and a refusal to be disquieted by uncomfortable change. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessie. There's so many things that I want to underscore in what you said, but a part of what I will underscore, not being able to hit on all of them, is again that point that you made that I think is so poignant about what about when systems do exactly what they're meant to do? What about when they work? And what if they were built to have people enslaved? What if they were built to make sure that there are people with vulnerabilities always in order to exploit, in order for folks to, in order for the state or in order for private companies to profit? And then the other thing that I just want to highlight is just the point around extended supply chains. And that being one of the systems that is incredibly hard to actually dig down into and really figure out where is there exploitation happening and how do we solve for it, especially where there's a lack of political will that wants to make that change. Thank you for that. So moving over to you, Filman, Eritrea remains a dictatorship, as you've talked about. Can you tell us more about how forced labor fits in with other oppressive tactics used by the government to control the population? And also, for those of you who flee, what sort of risks do you face?
Okay, perhaps something that I also wanted to mention is also part of the labor force is the outside factor, the enablers. It's one thing to have a dictator that doesn't care about his people. And then you have these foreign companies that hail from democratic countries with democratic values who exploit this situation, knowing full well this dictator doesn't care about his people and yet still participate. They always have this excuse that we do pay our employees, but as long as that employee lives and breathes in Eritrea, you can give him a sack full of gold. It will just take a few meters for him to be forced to give it up. You don't really need to have research to know what's happening in Eritrea right now. It's an open secret. When it comes how he controls people, even in diaspora, people are not completely free because you usually have someone back home. One critical point they use is the control of the embassies. Normally, any citizen of any nation, you need your passport, you just go to your embassy, fill out a form, you get your passport because it's supposed to serve you. In our case, it's different. In our case, it's a nightmare. I would never do that. I would never set foot in an Eritrean embassy as long as it's controlled by this regime. The first thing they do is they make you pay 2% of whatever income or imagined income that you had ever since you left the country. Now, this is hard by itself, but it's not even as bad as the next one. The next one is that you need to sign a false confession before you even ask anything. And that false confession is that you state that you are a criminal, that you have committed a crime by living in Eritrea the way you did. And anytime it sees fit that this regime will punish you in whatever way they want, and you sign it. Even if they manage to kidnap you and take you away back to Eritrea, even in a court of law, they can still say that you signed this willingly. And third, which is even more dangerous for us, is that you have to provide collateral. Collateral not in a sense of money or property, but rather, since they cannot completely control you here, they need a person as collateral back home. So So say you need a document that a German, a French, or a Swedish government demands from you. You go to the embassy, you give someone's name, and that person needs to show up and say, yes, I'm the guarantee. And this is in a way, not just then, even for the future, that you not mistape from whatever policies they have, so that you can never speak out against them. This is a way to control you. Once you go into this, then you're done. You're part of the circle, even though you're physically outside of the country.
Thank you so much for that. And I think the things that I really want to uplift in what you said are firstly the enablers, the outside forces, which gets to the second point of the fact that there's still so much control and so much fear even after you get out of this situation, even after you flee from the oppressive government, that you still have to be in fear of your life and of your loved ones' lives, and how much that does to control what you're able to do, how you're able to speak, and how much that fear is necessary in order for them to continue, and in order for the narrative to not shift, I suppose, for the outside individuals, for people who get out, and also for private actors, because if you're not allowed to speak up, then private actors can't be held accountable necessarily. That's really powerful. So we've been focusing a lot on the role of the state so far, and as we started to just talk about, we know that when it comes to modern slavery, a majority of exploitation happens in the private sector, so including in global supply chains. So Leonardo, based on your experience as a journalist, what is the role of the private sector in propping up or reinforcing authoritarian regimes, and how does this affect human rights abuses carried out by companies?
Well, taking an example of Brazil, in the case of my country, the 1964 coup d'etat took place by the militaries, but with strong support of businessmen who were unsatisfied with government projects that aimed to meet demands of peasants and workers that time, during the 60s. Once the coup was successful, this group not only obtained the freedom to carry out its agenda in both legislative and executive powers, but it also managed to repress unions and civil society organizations. Many workers' leaders were silenced through imprisonment, torture, exile, or assassinations. It's no wonder that former President Lula da Silva rise to prominence on the national stage begins to take shape when, then still a union leader, he leads a major workers' strike in the state of São Paulo, the richest in the country, in 1980, resulting in his arrest by the dictatorship. It's worth remembering that in authoritarian regime, labor rights are a matter for the police and not for unions. History found a way of repeating itself in 2018 when sectors of the economy, namely a portion of the agribusiness and the finance sector, expressed open support for then presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro, who presented a plan to reduce environmental and labor rights and cut out measures that punish slave labor practice. No, I'm not kidding. I stopped the reading, but it's not kidding. It's explicitly stated in the plan of government to reduce the protection of slave labor, the fight against slave labor. For Minister of the Economy, Bolsonaro picked Paulo Guedes, a man who has expressed admiration for the Chilean dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet, praising the ultra-liberal policies that were implemented in the South American neighborhood of Brazil at that time. Needless to say, the general only managed to carry out its agenda because of the dictatorial regime that was in place, one of the most violent in the region has experienced. This alliance with economic power bears fruits even without the breakdown of democracy with dictator wannabe politicians. In Brazil, the current government has worked with business representatives in Congress to weaken environmental and labor laws, regulations, and labor and environmental inspection. Today, Amazon is facing records of burns and deforestation, as everybody here is following in the social media. Of the more than 2,000 supply chains that we have tracked since 2001 at Report to Brazil, most of them are connected to large companies inside and outside the country, which is not surprising given that these are commodities that are consumed all over the world. A great number of these companies sue us or threaten us for revealing the slave labor. I have death threats against me. Sometimes I need police protection in Brazil. Because we are denouncing that the product, the goods that they use and sell are contaminated with slavery, with environmental damage, with indigenous killings, and so on. Other companies, however, are grateful because since the risk management that our information allows can ensure that they make decisions to correct the problems. The bottom line is that fixing these issues incurs significant costs. It means investing money to change practices. And there are companies that simply do the math and find it cheaper to support bad governments, what is business as usual, and nothing changes. Even because at the end of the day, in Brazil, slavery is not a matter of evilness, but a matter of seeking easy profits on a church of competitiveness.
Thank you so much for that. That also continues to underscore the role of both private corporations and authoritarian regimes in making sure that forced labor can continue to happen for profit. I was just really struck by the comment that you made about being sued for revealing slave labor and having death threats by companies because of that revealing. I think we live in a time where we think more people are going towards transparency. People want, like consumers want to make sure that we're buying products that aren't from forced labor, and we think that companies will move in that direction a little bit more easily because so many consumers want that. But to hear that that is continuing to happen, those lawsuits and those threats just reminds us of how real the desire is to have cheaper labor, cheaper goods, and doing anything to get that. So the last question that is for all of you as we wrap up, and this is just a quick, a quick round of answers. I'd just like you to answer one question, which is, what is one thing that the international community can do to address forced labor in authoritarian regimes? And I'll start with you, Jessie.
Thanks, Amy. I think at a normative level, we really need a shift in how this problem is conceptualized, moving from the idea that it's bad actors operating in specific conditions to one in which we're looking at broader systems of discrimination, marginalization, and abuse. Likewise, how it's talked about, moving away from heavily extrapolated statistics and sensationalized stories towards more nuanced, localized, contextualized anti-trafficking approaches based on geography, demography, economic sector, et cetera. And then, of course, I think there's a lot we can do in sort of how we vote at the polls and with our wallets as consumers or maybe even shareholders. So those that can, I think, advocating in their home governments to really push for mandatory human rights due diligence policies for companies that operate in their jurisdiction, as well as addressing anti-competitive behavior through perhaps antitrust reform and financial market regulation. If you have money invested in the stock market, anywhere, please push on your investment firms to think about how to establish reliable and comparable metrics for how we actually evaluate companies across social issues and set clear standards for where and how they operate with stringent clauses around forced labor based on a solid understanding of the risks that align with the current research. And I'll pass it back. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessie. And Philman?
In general, I would say due diligence to understand that this forced labor does not usually happen the way you expect it. It can always be camouflaged by a normal process of business, but in reality, if you dig down enough, you will find the slavery. But in case of Eritrea, complete and full break of communication. That's what any kind of financial commitment in Eritrea, especially beginning with the corporations, and even those educational funds that come, the majority of it will just end up in someone's pocket. An actual student or university student will probably see percentages of that. It's basically enabling the regime to exist. Well, just the same we had with COVID-related lockdown, just lock the entire country down, no contact. That is the only way we can get rid of this regime, in my opinion, I would say.
Thank you for that. It's powerful. And Leonardo?
Well, first, if slave labor is global and the trades of goods from slave labor is immediate, the fight against slave labor must be global and immediate too. International pressure, mainly from investors on companies and governments, is what yields results in Brazil today. And if we can move forward from a voluntary treat to a binding treat on business and human rights inside the United Nations, even better. At least eradicating slave labor and defending the future of Earth depends on how interested developed countries, the main beneficiaries of the global economic system, are in considerably reducing poverty in poor countries. This not depends only charity, but on the change in the business as usual way. Enslaving the environment and labor on the world's periphery and hiding these crimes in complex global production networks has never been acceptable, but now it can be exposed by civil society and the press. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have, I think, 30 seconds, so I'm going to just close us out and ask that if folks do have questions to come approach us after. Sorry, you won't be able to ask Jesse, but we can pass on the question and connect you. But I just want to say a huge thank you to each panelist sitting here. It really is an honor to be sitting with you, and I've learned so much during the session, and I'm just really grateful for your time, and thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate the participation.
It's like you sink in these chairs. Ready whenever you are. Hello and welcome. Thank you for surviving the long day and still finding a hope and enthusiasm to listen about the coup season. And it kind of coincides with the rainy season here. And this is going to be a little session where we are going to try to figure out what the heck with all of these coups. So what's happening? It's like, why? What's wrong? First of all, let me say, proud to be here, proud to be on Oslo Freedom Forum. For those of you who have been here, you know it's more of a family and less of a conference. For those of you who are here first time, I can promise you, this is not going to be your last time. My name is Srđan Popović. I'm Executive Director of Canvas. People often introduce me here as a Oslo Freedom Forum resident DJ. So whenever there is an event, they don't have anybody to lead, they kind of recruit me. So I sound always the same, where I'm talking about the coups, transitions, delivering medals, things of that kind, so sorry for that. That's just the autopilot. Today I'm going to have extraordinary pleasure to chat with you, and I hope it will be with you. So we'll be like 20 minutes talking, and then you take the lead. And we are going to have Waiknin Twinton. Did I make the mistake? How many?
Oh, it's great.
How many mispronunciations? Okay, why? This is easy. And democratic activist from Burma, country which recently experienced coup. Rania Abdelaziz, or Ronnie for France. Female rights, human rights activist leader from Sudan. Country which experienced coup, defeated coup, and now has coup again. And Jamila Rakib, a long-time friend of mine, though she's much younger than me, as you can see, who worked for years with Gene Sharp in Albert Einstein Institution, the institution that was really digging into the coup and probably made the best book called Anti-Coup about the coups and how to deal with coups ever. And if you are into coups or into countering coups, I highly recommend the free PDF on it. So I'll start with a long and impressive list. Zimbabwe, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Gabon, Sudan, Mali, Myanmar, Guinea, Sudan 2, Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso. These are the countries that experienced coups in the last 5 years. So it seems that we are very well into the coup season. Just to explain what the coup is, there is a group of enthusiastic generals which are unhappy with government. It helps if the government is less democratic, so there is no public support for the government. So once they grab the power, people like in Guinea will go to the streets and cheer up for the coup. Sometimes come after the long conflict between divided political parties, so the military is there to save Thailand from red shirts and yellow shirts or whatever. There is always a lovely excuse which comes with we mean stability. And this is the main selling point of this situation. And then they need time to consolidate this power. Well, guess what? They're illegitimate. Nobody ever elected military to really take off the job. So they need a legitimacy, they need obedience, and today's session would be about these two things. What is the magic formula for countering the coups, how the movements are doing it across the world, what the history teaches us about this, and I'll try to make it more like a TV show and less as a panel. So there is a camera, so this is actually looks like a TV show, and we have these fancy things coming from our ears. So without further ado, I will do the first round of very quick questions. And of course, I'll start with Jamila, who studied coups and spoke with people coming from the coup countries and read the books and write the books and even read the footnotes, something that I'm not capable of, about this kind of stuff. So Jamila, we know what the coup is, we know how it starts, we know what the explanation is, we know that the population is in the state of shock when this happens, and normally it's not something you would expect. Is there a magic formula to deal with it? Like once you're in this situation, what groups have been done?
Well, unfortunately, there's no magic formula, right, to so many things in life. But I am glad we're talking about this because, especially in this forum, I don't think we can talk about human rights and democracy without recognizing the role that coups have played and that they're playing in the world today in establishing dictatorships. But I think in thinking about coups, we also have to, recognize that there's a sort of classical model of a military kind of seizing power of the state, but there's also incremental coups, there's also electoral coups, there's the so-called autogolpe, or a self-coup, in which an elected leader kind of uses the institutions of the state, whether the military or,
which is happening in Tunisia as we speak.
Yeah, that's right. And in so many different cases, to kind of expand their own powers in order to stay in power illegally, against the Constitution. But I think in thinking about coups and what's the sort of relevant point, I think you pointed it out, and it's something we really should emphasize, and that is that coups are not single events, right? They're a series of events, they're a process, and from the time that a coup group tries to seize power to when it consolidates power and establishes a government is a very important period of time. And this is really, an opportunity because that establishment of power and that consolidation of power is not a given, right? It depends on so many different factors, and it's really what gives civil society, outside governments, regular citizens, legislative bodies, really an opportunity to launch an effective defense. And that's what we've, sort of studied as you pointed out. And I think at the root of it is this, these three things, two of which you mentioned. Deny the coup legitimacy, that means seizing the narrative, and denying it the cooperation and obedience and submission that it needs. And the third is to protect independent institutions. And there's obviously a whole kind of historical repertoire of what people have done to do that.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like we are looking into formula. And of course, we're going to go back to the legitimacy, which Putschists, of course, desperately need. They didn't draw it from the elections, so they don't have it. International legitimacy, ungovernability, but it requires a lot of thinking and a lot of strategy. But I'll start with emotions. February the 1st, it was my birthday, by the way. Yeah. You woke up February the 1st 2 years ago, and after successful elections and several years of semi-democracy in Burma, the tanks were again on the street. So how do you feel in this situation? And how you turn what I assume is a bulk of shock and anger into action?
Yes. Happy belated birthday, by the way. Very unfortunate.
They screw it. Gave me one more reason to hate them.
Yes. So, like you said, a year ago, the military decided to stage a coup. And so now when I meet people, a lot of people ask me, what is the situation in Burma? And what kind of human rights violations are happening under the military dictatorship? So my answer is that, human rights violations are happening every day. Even as we are sitting here, human rights violations are happening. But I correct them. We are not living under a military dictatorship. The military attempted to stage a coup last year, and it's an attempted coup, because even today people are still protesting, and the military hasn't been able to consolidate power. And that's an achievement for the people. Mm-hmm. Of course, in the beginning, we saw thousands of peaceful protesters on the street, and we saw that on the news. And the military dealt with it with the only language they know, which is violence. And we saw many peaceful protesters being shot in the head on the street, and more than thousands of people have been killed. And this is just a number that we know of. And over 13,000 political prisoners in Burma, because the military continue arresting anyone who stand up or speak up against the coup. And my father is one of the political prisoners, and I don't know when I will see him again, but we are one of many, many thousands. But all these activists on the ground, they know they will be arrested, there will be torture, they will be sexually abused, raped, and was killed. But knowing all of these risks, they still go out on the street and protest. And these protests are still happening today. It might not be thousands of people, but in a more creative way. We are seeing a silent strike, and the whole country are taking part by not going to market. And for the anniversary of the coup on 1st of February, the military really pressure people to open shops and supermarkets. But the creative way was a lot of shopkeepers come out to the market and just say, we're sold out. You know, we're not going to sell anything. So these are the acts of defiance we have been seeing. And of course, there are many young people who have faced violence, felt they have no choice but to take arms and fight against the military who have been killing, you know, unlawfully across the country. So, you know, all these protests and these acts of defiance, I feel because there is a determination. Because our determination, you know, gets stronger every day, and that determination is that we don't want to live under another military dictatorship, and we don't want to have our children grow up not knowing what freedom is, or not knowing what human rights is. We can't go back to the dark age again. So that determination is still there, and the hope is that the society in Burma is more united now. We are seeing a sense of solidarity and unity among ethnic nationalities across the country. And it's a really encouraging thing to see. And people are not calling for simple democracy anymore. They want inclusive model of federal democracy for the country. It's really encouraging. And of course, all these brave people who are risking their lives need international support to continue what they're doing and to keep up with hope. So, you know, coming here is great. I feel there is a sense of solidarity and is a great unit, you know, support. I want this unity, solidarity, and support to, you know, my people in Burma, and they really need that, and they're really desperate for support and help internationally.
Yeah, amazing points. I would just outline something that Jamila mentioned and that you just mentioned. There are at least 3 interesting things, and we can touch them in a second round. One way is creativity and what Jamila and myself in our boring language call the low-risk tactics. So as the oppression increases, you need to figure out how to give people something to do but still get away with it. So if people constantly get killed, they will be deterred from action. And we've seen many of these in Burma. We've seen Disney princesses march, and you know, it's like amazing cases of creativity, very difficult to suppress. Also, on more strategic level, what you mentioned is this something, once again, that Jamila and myself in our boring language will call parallel institutions. Like people not going to the schools, but instead going to the private schools and boycotting the schools run by the military. All of this is a part of package that you mentioned as ungovernability. So it's like, it's not only we deny you the legitimacy by calling you the putschists, but it's also we are not giving into your institutions. We build our own. So one of the interesting cases, of course, was Sudan. We had this lovely guy named Bashir, who was also a war criminal, and that guy was ousted from power by a popular action. And then, of course, the military seized the opportunity and stepped in. And then it appeared at first that they can be even more brutal than the guy who was in power there. And they want to be champions of killing and raping and putting bricks around people's legs and throwing them into the Nile. And still, in the country where you wouldn't expect it, I didn't expect it, because I haven't seen the level of organization, political parties, like usual troublemaking players. Still, Sudanese were capable to organize, mobilize, and force military to negotiation. So, how come?
How come?
Rania.
I think that came from the way we organized ourselves in the first revolution. This is revolution part 2, what we're going through now. But revolution part 1 was very organized. It started in December 2018. It started by protests outside Khartoum in a very small city called Damazin, and soon after started happening across the country. And then we have a body called the SPA, the Sudanese Professional Association, led the entire revolution. But the main actors of the revolution were mainly the civil society, not the political party. We had a coalition of different political parties and different armed groups They were like working in the back scene, but the actual on-the-ground work was done by revolutionaries themselves. So it's a civil society in its biggest, broader sense. Demand-based groups, parallel unions, professional groups, resistance committees. And this is the body, the resistance committees, the formation of the resistance committees from day one until today is what protecting our transition and what is continuing the revolution part 2. So what we did is, in the revolution part 1, it had 2 phases. The first phase was us taking to the streets, us organizing, strikes, professional strikes, boycotting the government, and boycotting all the entities supporting the government. And at the same time, we organized ourselves on the ground as resistance committees on wants and demands, and that shaped our vision on how we want to see the country transiting into democracy. And that ended by a power-sharing deal in June 2019. In round 2, in the revolution round 2, we have evolved a lot. If I look into how we started in 2018 from a few resistance committees around the country to how many resistance committees now, we can't even count them, there are more than 300. And all of these resistance committees now are filling the political vacuum. There is a huge political vacuum. Most of the political parties could not come up with one narrative or vision to aspire to the Sudanese people demands and wants. So these resistance committees now are filling the gap by working on political charters. There are 2 charters released, basically putting a roadmap to economic reforms, economic vision, political vision, and how we want to appoint a government to implement those visions. So we have evolved, our civil society grassroots movements have evolved a lot in the past 3 years into basically filling the political vacuum now in the scene.
Amazing. What I wanted to add as a comment and a question, what we see in Burma and Sudan, which impresses me, and that may be the prelude of what I'm going to ask Jamila next, is how you fight the vertical power with horizontal power. How Sudanese struggle was organized horizontally all the way to the neighborhood committees. So once they cut internet, people spread it by the word of mouth. How Burmese junta was caught off guard because they thought if they arrest everybody from NLD, which was the party ruling the country and ruling the government, and they start from the head all the way to the local organizations, they will somehow decapitate the resistance. But then boom, horizontally all the way around the place, the resistance was playing on. And it's a kind of surprise for the military, which is highly hierarchical organization, to go and kill all the generals. And still soldiers are fighting. They don't understand this thing. This is not what they teach them in a military school. So very impressive in both cases. These movements were capable to develop a horizontal organization outside of existing party political union structures. And actually this organization became the glue of resistance. And then people start flocking in. So, Jami, we mentioned at least 5 things you are an expert on. We mentioned taking the legitimacy. We mentioned ungovernability. We mentioned targeting the right institutions. We mentioned non-cooperation. We mentioned parallel institutions. So we also, what we didn't mention, and it really matters, you see soldiers switching sides or throwing the uniforms. You see the phenomenon called security forces defections. Why are these things so important? What's the purpose of these things? What's the dynamics of this thing?
Yeah, I think that the sort of symbolic acts of rejection of coups, calling it a coup. I mean, coups are successful not because people support them, but because people are too confused to act. They're shocked. They're not prepared. They act ineffectively. They use violence sometimes, which is, again, as we know in our field, that it really kind of ensures the reliability of security forces. So the initial sort of symbolic rejection of coups, which we've seen throughout history, like people wearing kind of ribbons to show that the support for the resistance is widespread, that people are not accepting, that they don't find it acceptable. Obviously international bodies can play a role in making clear that coups are not wanted and that the population doesn't support them. That's extremely important. And then for and we also saw, for example, the banging of the pots and pans. That's been really widespread. So the more widespread that we can show that there's a rejection of the coup, I think initially, as quickly as possible, that is extremely important. But obviously, non-cooperation by institutions in society that the coup needs in order to consolidate power is key. You mentioned security forces, the military, police. That's also a very key one. I think nonviolent discipline is important, right? Nonviolent discipline is important, communicating instructions to people about what they can do to do this widespread disobedience, and that could be outright refusal to obey orders by, government officials and bureaucrats and, other people, legislative bodies, judicial bodies, outright refusal, as we know, is highly risky and carries extreme risk of repression, but it's also the kinds of things like disguised disobedience. There's a lot of examples of people slowing down their work to cause deliberate inefficiencies in the system, taking sick days, losing important documents, forgetting to forgetting to pass on information, things like that. I mean, these are kind of instructions or things we can communicate to the population, in the first days of a coup that I think can be really important in really slowing down the system and creating these inefficiencies. I think nonviolent discipline, again, is important because we need to show security forces they're welcome into the movement, that they're not going to face the risk of violent reprisal. And I think overall, especially when faced with, rejection of the coup by citizens in a society, that can do a lot to weaken support, military support for a coup government. But I mean, overall, we know there's a whole diversity of actions that people can take, and there is no formula or recipe. But what we do know is that power has its sources. Coup governments need those institutions, and identifying where, what institutions they need and undermining support of those institutions is really key. And identifying really where are the pockets of power in society that can play a role in organizing resistance, and recognizing that, those pockets of resistance, those pockets of power, they're important in meeting the needs of the community. I mean, these are really, really difficult times. And so it's important to also recognize, that we need to take care of our communities and also use those neighborhood communities and other things, create them, strengthen them in order to carry out resistance.
Some amazing things you mentioned actually happened in real life, and without taking too much time from Wai and Ronnie, I will just mention some of them. Amazing idea that because it's COVID, teachers can call in sick in Burma, so there is no schools. Everybody has COVID, And then this amazing, super targeted thing that I'm still impressed with Sudan. It's like, as you said, denying legitimacy doesn't only mean denying legitimacy by yelling on street. It's denying services and skills. And if you take a look at what really freaked out the military at a certain stage in Sudanese revolution, it was a kind of a very interesting white strike made by people in banks that are doing SWIFT. And the problem with these type of skills is that I don't want to do SWIFT and you don't want to do SWIFT. You cannot bring in the soldier to run the SWIFT system because they have no skills. And by the way, it was the targeting the banks from which military was getting paid. So it really hurts. Going to what really hurts, we see a lot of examples of not only isolating Burmese junta or Myanmar junta diplomatically, which really matters. I mean, for God's sake, they persuaded ASEAN, which is not known as the most democratic body in the world, as well as Sudanese persuaded the African Union, the beautiful family of the dictators. Yeah, but they didn't recognize the coup. So that's the point. So it really happens. Like, they deny them legitimacy. I mean, I don't like the body, but they did what I like them to do. So how do you select these people, and how you move to this more strategic part where we are looking at the two very interesting campaigns, one hurting the national petrol and electric company as a main source of revenue in Burma, which I'm impressed with. Another one shutting down the brewery, which is owned by one of the generals. Because guess what? If you put together the Burmese junta and Sudanese junta, you're looking at not possibly Elon Musk size of money, but we are somewhere over there. These people are all full of money. So it's not about the military, it's not about the ideology, it's kleptocracy, INC. So how do you do this?
So we've been using all these strategies that we've talked about. So from the beginning, we saw a lot of teachers, nurses, doctors say we're not going to work under the military. So they refused to go back to their work and they shut down the whole system. And more people joined the civil disobedience movement. And now over a year later, you know, they're very, very courageous because they haven't got any income to support themselves or their family, but they're still continuing this movement. And of course, you know, the military didn't expect thousands of people to come on the street and protest, let alone people boycotting military companies and businesses. You know, all these people say, oh, we are not going to buy military products, cigarettes, beer, you know, we can...
yeah, by the way, the military owns the biggest cigarette factory, the biggest brewery, right. Just to give you an idea.
So, you know, they are doing these strategy, and, you know, it's part of our continuous movement, and strategy is we are trying to cut off the funding for the military because all the gas revenues they get is one of the biggest income sources for the military, and the activists on the ground have they lobbied for Total and Chevron to pull out of the country, and it was a big achievement. They did. These companies, big companies, pull out of the country because they don't want to do business with the military. That's an achievement of the people. And of course, you know, cutting off arms, but there are you know, countries that are still selling arms to the Burmese military, and countries like Japan, South Korea, and Turkey decided to impose arms embargo unilaterally. So it shows that it can happen, you know. And of course, deny legitimacy. We don't want to, you know, recognize the military as the head of the state, and that's an ongoing movement. And most importantly, justice and accountability, because there is a cycle of impunity happening for the Burmese military. They have been committing these atrocities for decades, and, you know, they committed genocide against the Rohingya, and they have been getting away with it. So there is a cycle of impunity. So we are encouraging international community to take action on that and to end that. So there is a continued strategy to, you know, achieve a true federal democracy in Burma. But of course, it's a very long process sometimes.
So that leads us to my last question to Rania, and then I kind of will open it to the audience. We see the strategy, we see successful tactics, we see successes, we see people standing for each other, we see solidarity, we see all of these things. And then transition is achieved, and guess what? The generals are, you know, jumping out of the box again. So how do you maintain morale? That's my key question. It's like inside the movement, how do you feel about it? How do you mobilize people again? How they don't say, oh, it can't be done?
It's not only the military, it's actually the military and the regional support that they're getting from a neighboring country. Other authoritarian countries in the region, they're not happy with any democracy happening in Sudan. So they're sabotaging it, but we are sabotaging it not only for the military, we're sabotaging the interest of those countries as well. How do we keep the morale? This actually reminds me of one thing. One of the resistance committees back in February released a statement, and that sums it up. The statement had one phrase says, "It's the fate of our generation to pay the price of ending military coups in Sudan, and we shall not postpone this fight and this battle." And that became the slogan of this phase. And the other resistance committees responded, that was a call for a march. And the other resistance committees across the country started responding on their Facebook pages saying, you're not going to walk this battle alone. So we had a mission. It's a clear one vision that we're going to end military coups in Sudan. Because we had, in our entire history since independence, we had only 11 years of interrupted democracies and always interrupted by a coup. So we know this is
So you're a pros.
Yes. It was like, you know what? We're ending this. And on the legitimacy page, that was the exact next morning, the same coup morning, the first slogan came out is 3 no's, and we're still sticking to this 3 no's. No partnership, no negotiation, no legitimacy to the military coup. So we have a clear vision. We waited a little bit for the political power to get their act together and come with a political narrative. And when this didn't happen, we stepped in and we filled this gap. How we are keeping the morale? We are keeping our vision clear, and we know we need to end military coups in Sudan.
Okay, so now I would like to ask the audience whether or not they have questions on this. Ending this with too many stories here that we heard these days are bleak. The reality is, even with all of their brutality and even with all of their still staying in power, these guys are in trouble in both cases. I mean, neither Buhari or the Burmese junta cannot sustain the thing. The GDP is shrinking, nobody loves them, there will be a positive development in this. And I want to end this part with a message of hope. You guys are doing great work. And keep doing it, you'll win.
Thank you.
And now up to you.
Hi. I'd like to follow up on the notion of horizontal organization fighting the vertical one. As much as I love this idea, and I think it's really powerful, I guess there has to be some level of organization even at the horizontal stage, at least when it comes to propagating to creating a strategy first and then to disseminating the strategy, which requires some level of verticality, I imagine, to one extent or another, and also command of communication tools. All of those things are points on which the vertical power can act. They can identify whoever is the key strategist or the key strategy group and decapitate it, or they can just shut down the internet or, I don't know, overpower you on Facebook or social media. How do you do to overcome this? And the question is both for Rania and why.
What was your model and how you survived horizontally and especially without internet?
Well, without internet, the coup happened, we started learning about the coup at 6 a.m. and the internet was shut down already. So we don't wait. When there is no internet, we go to the street to find out what's happening out there. We started coordinating. Luckily, we had the structure of the civil society and resistance committees in place since the revolution, and the connection between these groups were already happening on the ground. So we managed to keep the communication offline. But back to your point on how we started coordinating horizontally and the current charters, political charter that these resistance committees are coming up with, of course, we definitely at some point we need to go vertical and we need a political umbrella to embrace this and take it up. It's a pressure technique because the political act and the political actors on the scene, they're not really getting together, they're not managing to get one vision that the Sudanese people will agree on this vision and this demand. So we are filling this gap, hoping that some of these political parties will be open to take it and add to it and then take it further. At the same time, these are two different realities. There are two things happening in Sudan now. We have, on one side, we have the UNITAMS, which is the UN political mission assigned to Sudan, along with the African Union and the IGAD are working on a mediation process between the military, the military and their alliances, and the opposition, the civilian-led opposition. So they are working on a negotiation, and we are coming up, we're not happy with the narrative, we're not happy to go in a power-sharing deal again. This is why we're pressuring and coming up with our own narrative to the Sudanese people's vision. How do we want to rule? How do we want the economic reforms to happen? What is the political vision? So hopefully, I mean, these political parties cannot go without legitimacy. Even the UN and the African Union, whatever they're working on, if it does not aspire to the needs and the demands of the Sudanese people, it's of no value. So this is why we are working from our side, trying to formulate our vision, high level of coordination among all of these resistance committees, high level of democracy in voting, what is important to put first and what is not important now, is going on. So this will be picked, hopefully, by the political elites to discuss it and to take it on board. But the three no's are agreed on: no partnership, no legitimacy, and no negotiation with the military.
Why?
It's similar to us as well. In terms of the horizontal thing, even with the internet shutdown, they were able to, activist group, they were able to communicate with each other in the beginning. And when you see a group of people going out to protest, a lot of people follow them. And then, after about a couple of weeks, activists found out that maybe it would be better to create a coalition of protest groups, coalitions of General Strike Committee, and so they can communicate better. So we have a different committee organizing different protests and different sort of activities on the ground. And of course, at the same time, a lot of all these activists are talking about our vision for the future, what kind of country we want to live in, what kind of equality we want to have. So, and these, we have a legitimate government that was elected in election in November in 2020. So now that government is in exile, but also, of course, we are trying to make sure that all these visions are shared with the government, to make sure that when they come into power, they share with our vision. We are not going to let them get away with the normal democracy. We want the federal, because Burma is a country with many ethnic groups, and we have civil wars for many years. So we need equality, and we need an inclusive sort of system. So we have been building a system that can be that can accommodate all these ethnic nationalities, and we are sharing that with the exiled government. And hopefully, when they come back to Burma to govern, they can follow that. But it's led by the people.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Timothy, and I escaped from North Korea. We talk about coup for North Korea. It's almost impossible to have this coup d'etat. I mean, you can only imagine it's been happening over 74 years. But my question is on peaceful resistance, such as case in Burma, and after a few weeks in peaceful protests, eventually we saw even Miss Burma was holding AK-47, and fighting against its military and dictatorship. And would you think, such as a military, even or Sudan's case, that military resistance maybe will happen from civil society group as well? And having also mentioned the exile government you have just addressed, would they be able to take that play and role in resisting and fighting against this military dictatorship in a country like Burma?
So we have after many months of protest and many months of peaceful protesters being killed, this exiled government or legitimate government, National Unity Government, NUG, formed a People Defense Force, so PDF. So a lot of young people have joined this movement and go and get army training and taking taking arms against the Burmese military. And of course, because of the decades of civil wars, an ethnic armed control area is huge in Burma, and now with the combination of the PDF, this area is, really growing, expanding, and the military is losing on the ground in these areas, and the only thing they can win is to drop bombs from airplanes. So the activists, non-violence activists, people are protesting, what they are calling is to stop selling aviation fuel to the Burmese military. Because they said it's okay, we don't need to take a flight from one city to another, and it's only the middle-class, wealthy people do that anyway. We can just travel, but just stop selling aviation fuel to Burmese military, then they can't drop bombs anymore. So there is a kind of a harmony going on within different movements, and of course, people activists who are still protesting are doing with such risk. They are moving from one safe house to another, but they know they will be arrested, but they are doing it, and they leave a contingency plan. They said, if I get arrested, this is the plan, you have to continue the movement. And because, like I said, we are very determined. This should be our last struggle. This must be there has to be our last struggle. We are not going to let the military win, and we are not going to live under another military dictatorship.
Jamila, I know you have a strong opinion about military flanks of nonviolent movements. What does the history teaches us?
I mean, it's completely understandable that this level of repression would produce armed resistance. That goes without saying. I think what we know from the research is that, violent wings of nonviolent movements are actually a liability. In fact, they weaken the movement. And I think we have many, many cases to support that, that the very thing that you think is going to, increase your power actually creates sort of a malfunction in the nonviolent movement. So I think nonviolent discipline, as we know, is extremely important. I mean, resistance movements need widespread participation. They need participation from different segments in society. And when you kind of increase the reliance on violent means to defend the community, you're really reducing the participation by women, by older folks, by different people, younger folks, and really kind of creating the conditions for a civil war. And we know that's not really to the benefit of anyone. So it's by no means a moral argument. I think it's really a strategic one. I'm really interested in listening to you both about, we say we need a strategy to be effective, but coups are not something you can exactly plan for. But we do know that they are a problem in our world. So, Rania, you said that the revolution created the structures that are making resistance possible and sustainable now. I'm wondering, how can we do that in advance? Even among societies that are sort of taking democracy for granted, because we know there can be degradation in all of our societies. So I'm wondering, is there like a way to create a sort of civil resistance muscle that can be used to even maybe deter coups, right? With the idea that the would-be aggressor is going to face a costly, resistance, maybe even a shameful defeat like we're seeing. And almost like, a military capacity also defends against would-be aggressors. I mean, is there something like that we can do in our societies so that, when the time comes, if it comes, people are prepared to defend against it?
Yes. The only thing I can think of is also answering his question. I think it's building the readiness for that moment by educating on the nonviolence tactics, creating a space for dialogue or what's important for us as a nation, even if it's not directly political. And I believe every small act of resistance helps. So when the time comes for people to get together, a small act of resistance were built. For example, if I look at Sudan, my dad was resisting this government for 30 years, since 1991. Art movement, civil society. So all of this is small act of resistance, and the civic space that allowed people to speak about the rights, civil rights, created the right moment. So when it was time, that zero moment, that 0 hour for people to get ready, people were ready. And then we were learning on the go how to do it.
Amazing. Our time is leaking, and this lovely screen is beeping red. You don't see it, but I see it. So first of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being brave. Keep up the struggle. We'll get rid of these generals. We'll seize their assets. We'll send them to war tribunals. I promise I'll do my best to help. And once again, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies.